got the best part of the day. We've got Jonathan Asser here and his colleague Basil Abdul-Latif. Now I've seen these two talk at least about 5 times, and every time I see them speak, I come away learning something new about the way they work, but also something new about the way I work as well. And Jonathan's subject is about shame and violence, and I don't often feel violent, but I can say at times I do feel shame, although that's quite a difficult area for us to get into. So I won't hold back any further. I'll let them come up here. So big welcome, Jonathan Asser and Basil Abdul-Latif.
Good afternoon. Real pleasure to be here. I'm actually going to be talking for quite a while, and then Basil's going to come in towards the end. Do you want to be there for about 40 minutes, or would you rather sit down and then come up?
I'll sit down.
Yeah, okay. So we're going to be talking about shame violence intervention, which is a group-based prison therapeutic program that I've developed over the last 14 years. Sadly, it no longer operates. It was withdrawn at the beginning of this year. It's a program that aims to reduce levels of prison violence in a prison context. Broadly speaking, in prison we get 3 types of behaviour. The vast majority of prisoners are compliant with the regime. Many prisoners may be violent outside prison before coming into prison, but very, very few continue to be violent once they're behind the prison walls. With this vast majority of prisoners who are compliant and reasonably well behaved in prison, there are many opportunities for education and personal development addressing offending behaviour. There's a second category of prisoner which is non-compliant with the regime that does present serious problems in a prison setting, and those are prisoners whose violence is primarily directed at themselves. So prisoners involved in a range of self-harming behaviour such as cutting, hanging, overdosing. Now, as with the vast majority of prisoners who are well behaved, there are also lots of programs for the self-harming prisoner. There's a multidisciplinary teamwork approach to keeping them safe, massive psychological support, therapeutic support. Then we get a third category of prisoner where the violence is directed primarily away from the self. So victims are created, external victims are created within a prison setting. Now, many of these violently enacting prisoners have ongoing serious mental health disturbance and psychotic disturbance, and these prisoners are treated in a healthcare department that is within the prison walls. However, they're looked after by the NHS in line with medical ethics and protocol. This then leaves a really, really small number of prisoners who are involved in being violent towards others in prison, but who don't have any serious ongoing mental health disturbance, who don't have any psychotic problems. Now, whereas the prisoners we've so far talked about have masses of intervention support, there's absolutely nothing for the non-psychotic violent enactor in prison, apart from punishment, segregation, separation, moving them around the system. And it's this non-psychotic violent enactor which is the target group for shame violence intervention. Now, I have my very close colleague here, Mr. Basil Abdul-Latif, who won't mind me saying that he used to fall into that category of the non-psychotic violent enacting prisoner. In the largest prison in Western Europe, which is where I've developed this program, Basil was without doubt one of the most violent control problems in the jail. And he came into the SVI program, and we're going to be hearing from him later, which is really the highlight of the whole presentation, but I'm going to do my best to prepare for that moment. Now, in looking at the sort of violence committed by the non-psychotic violent enactor, in every single case, and over 14 years that runs into hundreds, even thousands of incidents, absolutely every single case, I have found what I would call a shame trigger causing the violence. That is disrespect, issues around status, a feeling of somehow being belittled or disregarded has given rise to the violent enactment. At the very eminent, how do I do this next? That's it. The very eminent psychiatrist James Gilligan, former director of the Centre for the Study of Violence at Harvard, says, "I have yet to see a serious act of violence that was not provoked by the experience of feeling shamed and humiliated, disrespected and ridiculed, and that did not represent the attempt to prevent or undo this loss of face, no matter how severe the punishment, even if it includes death." So the threat to the psyche from shame can be experienced as so intense that in order to protect the psyche from the shame experience, the person can be prepared in a physical sense to die. So what sorts of violence are we talking about in a prison setting? My working definition of violence is trauma inflicted in order to control. And the trauma can be inflicted on the self to control the self, inflicted on somebody else to control somebody else. The infliction of trauma can be conscious or unconscious. We may not be aware that we're being violent. And I guess a working definition of trauma for me is something that cannot be processed, something that cannot be metabolized, so it stays lodged. And we're talking about insulting behaviour, so emotional trauma may occur. We're talking about abusive behaviour. We're talking about threatening behaviour. Also, we're talking about fighting between prisoners, so actual contact violence. Then we're also talking about assaults on other prisoners, on staff, or on visitors to the prison. And I'm going to give you an example of a shame-based violent incident, which is not... I'm not going to choose an actual incident, but this is indicative of an extreme form of violence. And prison is an extreme place, so this kind of violence does happen, and certainly I work with people who perpetrate this level of violence. Basil has also worked with people who perpetrate that level of violence in segregation settings, working alongside of me as part of his journey. Let's say we've got a prisoner who goes down to the servery where he's given his meal. The meal is distributed by other prisoners. He's in the queue. He sees loaves of bread being distributed to one or two high-status prisoners by the guy behind the bread man, as he's known, which is the prisoner giving out the bread. Our prisoner gets to the bread man, asks for an additional slice of bread, and is refused the additional slice of bread. He's seeing other people with 6, 7 slices, some people very high status with a couple of loaves. He goes back to his cell and dwells on the fact that he feels disrespected by this. He feels shame. He feels his status is at stake. Everybody in prison is allowed to have a razor blade to shave with unless they're on a particular level of suicide watch from the self-harming prisoner. He takes his razor blade, he breaks the plastic, he then takes that individual razor blade, melts the end of a toothbrush and inserts the razor blade in the melted plastic, so he's now got a slashing weapon. He returns to the servery, walks up to the bread man and opens up his face from his ear right round to his chin. Helicoptered out, the guy could die. Let's say, on this example, he lives. I sometimes get asked what's the difference between shame and guilt. And in this example, we can see that the perpetrator doesn't feel he's done anything wrong. So guilt relates to the specifics of thought and action, and there's always the possibility, however small, of making some kind of reparation, of saying sorry, or somehow redressing what has gone wrong, however inadequately. Shame is something different. Shame is this global threat to the self. It's not about the specifics of right and wrong. It's something that feels as if it could take away my very life. And ironically, I might be prepared to sacrifice my actual physical life to hold on to that sense of psychological life. James Gilligan again, violence towards others, such as homicide, is an attempt to replace shame with pride. So we can see shame and pride on a continuum, and the violence converts the shame into pride because I locate my shame as the perpetrator outside of myself into the victim. Psychologist Carl Schneider says that we experience shame when we feel we're placed out of the context within which we wish to be interpreted. So if I wish to be interpreted over in this context, something happens to make me feel I'm being seen over in this context, the emotion that tells me that that's happening is shame. And the fantastic thing about shame is that it's an emotional reaction, so it's instantaneous. If I'm trying to think things through, it can take time, even a second or 2 seconds. Shame just happens like that, and it tells you immediately that status is under threat, that I may be being interpreted within a context that I don't wish to be interpreted in. Psychoanalyst Warren Kingston says that the origins of the word shame are obscure, but scholars believe it derives from the Teutonic root skem, meaning to cover oneself. So the etymology of shame is indicative of hiding behaviour. That's the big clue telling us that when we're talking about shame dynamics, we're talking about hiding behaviour. We're talking about covering oneself up. Anthropologist Benjamin Kilbourne, I feel ashamed means I do not wish to be seen. So when we think about not wishing to be seen and how that relates to shame, we can see that violence is another form of hiding behaviour. It's another way of wishing not to be seen. Because we have our shame and our pride on this continuum, the perpetrator of shame-based violence doesn't want to be seen as somebody who's suffering from that threatening experience of shame. He wants to be seen as high status, someone who can take care of business, someone who never gets threatened, someone who can control other people. Violence, another form of hiding behaviour. Now, there is a story that I'm certain everybody in this room is very, very familiar with that tells us about the link between shame and hiding behaviour and how that hiding behaviour can lead to violence. All of us know this story. All of us were brought up with this story. And this story goes on to suggest, in symbolic form, that shame and hiding behaviour and the resulting violence are fundamental to the formation of our human culture. Now, the story is the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve eat of the forbidden fruit. This places them outside the context within which they wish to be interpreted. So what do? They cover themselves up. So the fig leaves are symbolic of the hiding behaviour in response to the shame experience. Then, when God comes looking for them in the garden, then the man and his wife heard the sound of the Lord God as he was walking in the garden in the cool of the day. And they hid from the Lord God among the trees of the garden. From there, beautifully expressed in a symbolic way, the link between shame and hiding then takes us to the first murder. Shame, hiding behaviour, violence. Adam and Eve have 2 sons. The youngest son, Abel, offers his gift to God. The gift is accepted. The elder son offers his gift to God. The gift is rejected. This places the elder son outside of the context within which he wishes to be interpreted. He has the shame experience, and he's involved in hiding behaviour because he conceals his intentions from his brother. Now, Cain said to his brother Abel, "Let's go out into the field," hiding behaviour, concealing his intention, concealing his motivation. And while they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. Sociologists Scheffer and Retzinger are very powerful in the way they think about shame. And they say that shame may be the most social of all emotions, since it functions as a signal of threat to the social bond. The most social of all emotions. If we come back to our idea of context and interpretation, it's the shame that signals the threat to the social bond, signals the threat to status, that instantaneous signal. Fantastic, because if we can learn to read this signal, we can learn to make interventions in real time, in the now, to protect social bonds and repair them. No need for hiding behaviour, no need for violence. But there's a problem. In our civilization, shame is shameful, as Scheffer and Retzinger go on to say, except under extreme circumstances, we deny its existence. So, perhaps this can be something for us to think about as counsellors, as therapists, as practitioners. In our practice, to what extent is shame shameful in the room? To what extent can shame be surfaced? Retzinger and Scheff again, the idea of the social bond is repressed in modern societies, masked by the ideology of individualism. So I go to school, I pass my exams, I compete against other students to access training, to compete against other students to get into employment, to compete against other employees in order to advance myself. So in order to progress in our society, I need to take on board the ideology of individualism. Now, the problem with this is that the shame signal is constantly triggered in a system whereby individual achievement is the ultimate mark of success. Because the shame signal is being triggered saying we need to address social bonds, we need to repair social bonds, we need to nurture social bonds. I have to find a way of switching that off in order to operate, in order to function in our individualistic society. Epidemiologist Richard Wilkinson For at least 90% of the time we have existed as anatomically modern human beings with brains as large as they are now, the evidence suggests that we lived in highly egalitarian societies. So as hunter-gatherers, we depended on the state of our social bonds in order to survive. So not a society based on individual achievement, but a society whereby social bonds were essential to staying alive on a daily basis. And it was shame that evolved as part of our hunter-gatherer existence in order to signal threats to social bonds, in order to allow us to make those interventions in real time to keep our social bonds repaired and functional. So one way of looking at shame violence intervention is we're almost going back to our hunter-gatherer existence, reconnecting with our shame awareness, redeveloping our shame awareness in order to reduce hiding behaviour and reduce levels of violence. So shame violence intervention is an innovative program, and I was very proud that it received the BACP Award for Innovation a few years ago. And the first major innovation is in SVI, shame violence intervention, I select for violence. So it's that target group, the non-psychotic violent enacting prisoner, that is the target group for SVI. In all other programs in the UK prison system, if you're currently being violent, you're taken off the program, or you're not given access to the program. You have to be violence adjudication free for a period of time. So SVI turns that on its head and actually seeks out these people currently being violent in the system and brings them together. And it brings them together with no agenda for change. There isn't even a rule, a ground rule in SVI to refrain from violence in a session. So we have a selection for violence, we have no agenda, discussion program, any topic. Disrespect inevitably happens, and so we get into the heat of the moment. We get escalation. And this is again a big difference between SVI and other programs, because in other programs you're invited to talk about stuff you're not actually feeling at the time. So you're invited to think about potential high-risk situations and imagine how you might act in that high-risk situation. Even in therapeutic communities, if you get out of your chair as part of a session in a violent rage, you can be removed from the community for actually standing up and not staying seated. SVI is a completely different thing. We're getting into the heat of the moment. People are moving around the room. There's body language. There's very, very high levels on the volume thing, which is why we had to meet in a room away from everywhere, so we wouldn't actually disturb other people getting on with their day because of the amount of noise generated. So at the moment, I can imagine that if I was in the audience, I might be thinking, well, hold on a second, this probably isn't a very good idea, because you've selected for violence, you've got no agenda, and now suddenly you're getting into the heat of the moment, and you've got escalation. The key to keeping things safe in SVI is shame-aware facilitation. And shame-aware facilitation is something that I'm doing, and it's something that other people in the program learn how to do and become my colleagues and allies in terms of facilitating in the heat of the moment. And what am I doing in shame-aware facilitation? What does that look like? What is that? Well, it's very different from counselling and psychotherapy. It's not counselling, it's not psychotherapy. It's informed by my training and reading and supervision and experience, but it's something different to access a high-risk target group who couldn't be accessed without a high level of transparency on my part. So that's being very open about my life, my past, my trauma. It's in particular being very open about my need, my personal need for SVI. So without any blame or aspersions on anybody who might have been caring for me as I grew up, I will be open about feeling terrified, feeling shamed, feeling desolate throughout my developmental trauma of growing up with no experience on my part of any safety whatsoever, which led me to need a sense of belonging, to need a sense of connection, to need a sense of family. And I found that in the SVI program, in developing and creating this work. That's where I felt at home. So that's something I might share. And if I can manage the shame around completely lacking a sense of belonging and around being desolate inside, then maybe other people can manage that shame as well. Transparency, key to SVI. What I'm doing on a second-to-second basis is I'm supporting the person in any session who is under most pressure from shame, because it's that person who's going to become violent, either in the session or, like Cain in our beautiful story, illustrative story, who hid and then became violent later. So there's a real risk of violence between sessions in SVI. So what I need to do, it's my responsibility, having brought these people there, to keep people safe, and I do that by supporting who's ever under most pressure at any given moment. If I can support that person to tolerate their shame, we're never going to have to get to violence because of the causal link between shame and violence. How do I support that person? I do it in a dynamic way by confronting the person who's bringing the shaming pressure. The beauty of confrontation is that I never have to indicate who I'm supporting, because that would be shameful in itself and cause the violence I'm trying to avert. And what I'm trying to do in the confrontation is I'm trying to match the power of the person I'm confronting. If I get it wrong and cause a shame overload, then I'll get hurt. So matching power involves making myself the target, as opposed to the person who's under most pressure from shame, and then it's managing that threat. And then as I manage that threat, other people will come in and the facilitation role gets shared. But as the leader of the program, it has to be me who basically takes it on directly. And what I'm doing in matching power and making myself the target is I'm giving people a choice, either to attack me or take it to the next level of escalation or stop. And if you give people a choice, it helps them manage their shame, and if they can manage their shame, the violence won't happen. No matter how much escalation we get, no matter how risked the people are in the session, the violence won't happen, because the most high-risk person is managing their shame. I've done a couple of talks, 3 or 4 talks, very, very honoured and privileged to have done a number of talks for BACP, and feedback I've got is, okay, well, we get the link between shame and violence, we sort of get an idea of how the facilitation works, but what are you actually doing in a session? What are you saying? How are you behaving? And I guess if someone were to film a live SVI session, you might be quite bemused about, who am I sort of planted in the middle of this? What on earth is going on? Well, yes, I work with transparency when the escalation level is low, if you like, almost building trust and preparing the platform for when escalation does happen. But once escalation is happening, my emphasis is much more on my body language than what I actually say. And the most important aspect of body language that I'm working with in escalation is my gaze. So just looking at somebody in this setting can be experienced as a very powerful motivator to becoming violent. So using the gaze is a very, very, very potent tool. And I'm looking at the person I'm confronting, so I become the interpreter to his context, which puts him under a degree of pressure. I'm not looking at the person I'm supporting, so I'm giving him a break, and I'm not signaling that he's the person I'm supporting. And just that gaze itself can take that person into the moment that I'm confronting, so the shame is there, and we get to the choice to either take it up or stop. the whole thing has to be calibrated through shame awareness. So you haven't got time to think what's going on. You're going with the flow, and that's the fantastic thing about shame awareness. I experience it right here, and if the shame levels are high, I think big threats to social bonds. If they're low, I think, you know, we're repairing and nurturing well here. And that feedback is instantaneous. So I can calibrate my gaze, for example, based on that, and it never lets me down. We've never had a violent incident in a contact violent incident in any SVI session ever. And on other programs, not selecting for violence, not working in the heat of the moment, you will have many violent incidents. We've actually never had one in SVI. And we've never had a violent incident in SVI between sessions involving active participants to SVI, even though violence will have happened on many occasions between participants before they come into the program. Working with escalation and de-escalation creates a shared sense of belonging in the group. And I'm transparent about needing that myself, and that's why I've been prepared to take the risks that I've taken in order to develop and facilitate this work. That sense of belonging becomes shared, and that places SVI slap bang in the middle of the dynamics of violent gang culture. In my experience, a sense of belonging is the primary reward of being in a violent gang group or organisation. It's more important to the psyche to have that sense of belonging than it is to the rest of the person to have the money and the power. What happens from there is we develop what I might term a super gang. So a sense of belonging is being shared around gang members from different gangs competing for territory within the same prison. Largest prison in Western Europe. There are drug issues. Money can be made in that setting. The product is more expensive within the prison walls than it is outside, so territory becomes extremely important, and the levels of tension that exist within competing gangs, groups, organisations can be extreme. In SVI, they're coming together and they're finding a way of resolving their disputes without violence taking place. This gives rise to a leadership problem. In violent gang culture, the biggest threat to the leader of the gang comes from his own people. Because he's selected people for violence, those people are around him on a daily basis. There's shame and pressure on the fact that he's the leader, they're lower down than him. So the fact they've been selected for violence, they're experiencing shame and pressure by not being the leader, puts his life under threat. So the violent gang leader stays alive for as long as he can by deflecting that violence away from himself onto other people, which may mean other members of other rival violent gangs. He deflects the violence away from himself to stay alive. Now, I don't deflect the violence away. I work with direct confrontation and use shame awareness to achieve de-escalation. I'm the leader and I'm still alive. So that means what we're doing in SVI is we're transforming the dynamics of violent gang culture because we're facilitating the sense of belonging, the primary reward that it's all about, but we're facilitating it with no collateral victimization. A problem here arises in relation to the fact that senses of belonging can compete with each other. And I'm building a sense of belonging that's shared among violent gang members who are control problems in the prison. And that shared sense of belonging then pressurizes staff whose sense of belonging is derived from controlling that group and running an orderly establishment. What I'm doing is bringing them together, working in the heat of the moment with an element of apparent chaos and de-escalating without blood on the walls. The fact that I'm able to do that working with group members destabilizes the sense of belonging of staff based on a very different way of working with people through segregation, transfer. Remember, we're talking about that small minority of control problem prisoners. So from this perspective of competing senses of belonging, it's perhaps miraculous that I was able to develop SVI and run SVI for as long as I did. SVI has been independently evaluated at national level by the National Offender Management Service, interviewing prisoners before they went into SVI, and then on a weekly basis with an allocated forensic psychologist. And it was found that participants in SVI take on board various learning outcomes associated with resolving conflict. And I'm going to read the learning outcomes out to you. And as I read them out to you, I'd like you to reflect on the fact that there's no agenda for change in SVI. There's no even ground rule to refrain from violence in the session. Plus, we're selecting the most violent for whom there isn't anything else apart from segregation and separation, and bringing them together in the heat of the moment. This is what the forensic psychologists found SVI prisoners took on board. Developed ability to reason with problems and resolve them. Developed ability to resolve interpersonal conflict. Developed ability to manage emotions more appropriately. Developed ability to understand perspectives of others. Reduction of hostility and anger towards others. Reduction in impulsive acts towards others. Improvement in self-esteem. Improvement in ability to listen to others. So if we take that qualitative evidence and link it up to what happens on a quantitative basis, we see a drop in violent incidents committed by this group 3 months, comparing 3 months before joining to 3 months after joining. Now, correlation doesn't necessarily imply causality. There may be other reasons why the violence is coming down. However, a picture is certainly being painted. Perhaps the real evaluation is, as I've said earlier, there isn't blood on the walls in an SVI session, because we're bringing people together. It would normally be regarded as too high risk to bring together, and somehow we're finding a way to build a sense of belonging with these people. Eckhart Tolle says, when you receive whoever comes into the space of now as a noble guest, when you allow each person to be as they are, they begin to change. So without that agenda for change, allowing people to be as they are in a potentially high-risk situation has the results as we've seen. And finally, from me, psychiatrist Donald Nathanson, the therapeutic system that ignores shame produces only shallow cures. Now, I wouldn't say, and this is in the spirit of SVI to work with transparency, so I wouldn't say that my therapy, that I was very privileged and lucky to have over many years, being a patient in psychoanalytic psychotherapy, I wouldn't say that my therapy ever cured me. But what it did do is it took me deep into my trauma and gave me the capacity to bear my trauma, and the shame awareness was the result of that I then took in the prison system and developed SVI with. So I'd like to dedicate my presentation to my therapist, who's a very courageous woman who worked with me for many years. Thank you very much. That's my bit. And now, Basil, welcome to your show.
Yeah, I would first like to thank all the VACP members and Richard and all the admin staff for allowing us to come here to talk. I'll first talk about how I met Joel. It was 2007 and I was in prison, and I'd been in young offenders establishments before that, but I'd now progressed to the adult side of prison. So I was in prison and I was with a cellmate. Now, normally I don't share a cell, I'm high risk, but on this occasion I allowed myself to share with someone who I knew from outside prison. So basically what happened, I was on the wing, and because of my previous record in prison, it used to follow me around, even though I may have come a long way from when I was young. It was still the same old prison officers, prison governors, so everyone would be the same, so my record would kind of follow me. So I was secluded to the wing. I wasn't allowed to go education. I very rarely was allowed to go gym or do anything. So I'd find myself mingling on the wing. And that's when I first met Joe. I didn't meet him formally, but I used to see him coming on the wing and taking other guys who I knew away. And I used to think to myself, why do these guys keep going away with Joe? Until I asked them, and they said to me one day I should come. But it was not a referral. It was more like you had to be waited for Joel to come, SVI to come to you. So one day my child...
Can I make a comment? Is that right? And this is Basil's raising a really huge point. So what can happen is people could potentially feel pressurised to be violent to get onto SVI. So one has to work with an assessment of risk so that people aren't actually motivated to be violent to get there.
Okay.
So I hope Basil isn't going to...
Basically, so me and my cellmate had a fight one day, and
I knew that was going to happen.
basically it was nothing to do with SVI, but we just had a fight because we fell out, and Joel came to my cell with a paper, and I said to him, he's like a dodgy car salesman, and he come up to me and said, I've heard that you've been involved in altercation, and would you like to come to a group or a gathering that I do? And obviously he didn't mention it was therapeutic or anything like that. He just said, would I like to come? He didn't say it's mandatory. So I said, all right, I knew a lot of people that went to his thing, and also my brother, who has been in jail for a very long time. I spoke with him, and he said, yeah, Joe's, he had dealings with Joe as well. So I went to see Joe, and the first time I went there, it was like, it was overwhelming. Like, me and my cellmate were opposite to each other, and we were surrounded by people we knew, some we didn't know, but very high-ranking people in the prison system, some major drug dealers, some, and we would talk with each other, and we would try to reason things out. And, as the weeks progressed, me and my cellmate resolved our problems, and we found ourselves trying to resolve other people's problems. Some people didn't want to participate in SVI, some did, and gradually over time, me and Joe built up a good relationship. But unfortunately, when I used to get released from prison, there was no follow-up work, because I would always be acquitted of whatever I was in jail for. So I would go back to my community, and it'd be the same old me, forget about SVI, forget about this. Until one day, a guy who I introduced to Joe in the prison reintroduced me back to Joe. And I was going through the court processes then, and I remember Joe inviting me to do one talk. I think it was the serious violence one.
Yeah. That's right.
Where was it? Westminster.
The London Serious Youth
Yeah.
Violence Board. Yeah.
Joe invited me.
The Central Hall.
Yeah, to one building in Westminster, and I just come back from court, and I went there and I strolled in, and I remember Joe and that were talking on stage, and he got me right into action, and I saw life for a different light, and I realised like the life that I was living is not really the real life. This is the real life. I opened my eyes and realised that what I used to live and what I used to do, is pointless. So I started changing my life. I started doing some charitable work, talking to people, and that some people, they don't want to listen, some people do. But the key thing with Joe and SVI, there's no grasping or how would I say, there's no obligation to tell on somebody. It's totally confidential unless, it's something of a very, very serious nature. But, we've got a lot of trust for Joe and SVI, and, he's done a lot for me and other people, and, the most I can do is come here to support him along his travels and explained to everyone how great the work he's done. Unfortunately, the prison service do not want to, give him the credit he deserves because they want us to fail. But you know, it's nice to know that there's someone out there that wants to see us change our lives and turn around instead of being a failure.
Great. So I think we're going to go on to audience questions.
Yeah.
You want me to ask you questions?
No, ask me.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Well, audience questions. If anyone would like to ask a question.
Come on, don't be shy.
Hello. Yes, Joe, is it? Yeah.
Joe, for sure.
You know the Eckhart Tolle thing, where you mentioned letting the shame sort of play itself out, letting the confrontation occur. Reminded me a bit of the R.D. Lang situation. You know, where you allow psychosis to play itself out and to allow the person to be who he is, rather than taking preventative measures. But that puts you in a sort of right in the thick of it. I just wonder how that affects you as a person, as a sort of in vivo therapist, if you like, because you're right in the centre of things. How does that affect you personally, to be in that sort of, what was your phrase, in the heat of things all the time?
Well, the person that impacted me was that it gave me a sense of belonging. So it gave me a sense of connection and, paradoxically, a sense of safety that I didn't experience in the outside world. So I felt safer once the bars were pulled shut and the doors were shut and the officers were miles away and it was me and the group. And then I felt I could start to work on some of my inner violence as well as, you know, if it worked for somebody else, it was a bonus.
Yeah, it sounds good. It sounds just right for you, like you were part of
Absolutely,
the
and that, by the way,
process.
is the transparency, which is essential to shame-aware facilitation. It'd be too dangerous to do without that.
Yeah, cool. Thanks. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I actually work in prisons at the minute. What were your support mechanisms while you was a bit, you know, you were singly within a group, but yet, if there was any violence, what would have been your support mechanisms?
There wasn't any violence.
Yeah, but if there would have been, what would have they? What would? Because it's.
I don't
I
understand
mean,
the question.
at the beginning, you know, when it sounded like you were sort of like putting a match into a petrol tank and just waiting for this explosion.
No.
Yeah.
No. Perhaps I should explain. We probably don't have enough time, but we can always talk afterwards. The first thing about me is I'm frightened of physical violence. So I'm a coward. I don't want to get hurt. And certainly if I brought people together, I certainly don't want to get anybody else hurt. And the reason why I've got the confidence to do this work relates to the focus of the talk, which is shame awareness. If you're in touch with shame awareness, that's an ongoing risk assessment in the moment, giving infallible data on how to make an intervention to repair and nurture social bonds. That's the ultimate risk assessment. And, you know, let's talk afterwards, but I don't think we've got time to go into further detail right now. And I'd like the next question to be for Basil, if someone has got a question for Basil.
Can I just say that I admire both of you so much, and I think it's amazing at what you're doing, and I feel it's a really needy area with all the guidelines and what's going on today, and it's such a neglected area as well. So I do admire you both. And Basil, I mean, especially even for you to be able to like turn your life around and to come up here and to stand up there, you know, it makes you quite an amazing human being in my eyes, because it must have been some journey. It sounds like it was.
Like coming to places like this is like a motivation for me. Like I used to be in Joe nearly every year, but I don't know, since like doing work with Joe, I think it's been over a year and a half, nearly 2 years, and I haven't been arrested or anything for nearly a year and a half. So, you know, that may seem small, but not short time, but for me, that's kind of long. And obviously, most of it's to do with Joe and SVI. I can't lie and say everything's to do with Joe. Maybe I just grew up, and part of me grew up as well. But Joe and SVI was a main contributing factor in my life. And, you know, I feel embarrassed to say that, you know, SVI did it for me, because it's a shameful thing. I should have been able to do it solely for myself. So, you know, I owe Joe and SVI a lot of gratitude.
And can I just comment on that? Because that beautifully captures the clinical point about the shame of needing and the embarrassment of needing something. And that's why transparent facilitation is absolutely essential to making SVI work.
Can I just say also that it sounds like you're making sure that at the right time. You know,
Yeah.
And credit to
Thank you.
Hi, Basil. You kind of answered my question, because I was wondering about how you're living with your shame now, and how obviously you've been able to deal with it in prison, but does it still affect you in your day-to-day living, and how do you manage that so well?
Like, I'm not gonna lie to you, yeah. I don't get involved in any criminal activities, but like I still try to mediate, like between me and Joe and other like high level. Like obviously Joe only deals with people at the top. Like it wouldn't work. SVI wouldn't work for people that, you know, that don't have status. So, you know, I try to bring them to Joe, and you know, sometimes there's been reunions where people have come to work with Joe. We've tried to do things with other prisoners, but you know, I think like it weren't for them.
I'm going no comment on that.
But anyway, so obviously, like I don't know, like I just try to like.
Can I sort of just try? So I think the question. I mean, I just want to jump into this thing of shame. I mean, do you have a sense of managing shame? I think there was something around that.
I was trying to ask that because I'm conscious
and
of
the thing about SVI is none of this has to be conscious whatsoever. There doesn't have to be any consciousness around the process. But I mean, I'm curious. I mean, if I talk about shame awareness on a conscious level, does it seem like nonsense, or does it?
No, it makes sense. Like before, I would be very ashamed, like to even admit I have a problem.
Okay.
But, you know, me coming to SVI and other, you know, stuff like that. It's me admitting that I have a problem and I need to address it. So,
Okay.
you know, that helped me coming to SVI, and you know, trying to bring other people. Is me admitting that I've got a problem and me showing them as well.
Okay.
It's not a shameful thing to admit you have a problem,
Okay.
because a lot of people are ashamed to admit they got a problem.
Okay.
It's like someone that's an alcoholic, you'd be very ashamed to admit he's an alcoholic. But you know, with the right person and in time, you know, maybe you can help them.
Okay. And so what I'm taking from that is links to hiding behaviour, and it sounds from what Basil is saying is he found a way of not being ashamed of being ashamed, which meant he didn't have to hide and didn't have to involve himself in violent activity as part of that hiding behaviour, and then was able to confront and deal with what was there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Basil, can I just ask you, you said that you've not been in trouble for the last year and a half, which is absolutely great.
Yeah.
Has it actually made a difference to your levels of violence? Do you feel that that's changed for you?
Yeah, it has. I can't say I haven't been in trouble. Like I've been stopped and questioned about like a little domestic here, but obviously, you know, that was a long time ago. But like, I've grown out of all of this. Like I'm 25 and I'm receding. Like I've got a little daughter now, so I haven't really got time, like, you know, to do all of this. I've just grown out of it, and I hope a lot of the people below, like younger than me, will see the light one day, because, you know, in London it's terrible, you know, a lot of people killing themselves. Unfortunately, it's all school children and that, you know. So I just hope that, you know, people can see the light. It's not a shameful thing, you know. You just gotta be strong within to admit that you have a problem.
I just want to say well done to you.
Thank you very much.
And Joe, can I ask you a question as well?
Yeah.
This system sounds fantastic, but is this replicable? Is it something that's your baby, or is it something that you can teach other people to do in other prisons?
Right. It can be replicated. This is what would be needed. Is people would have to research me first of all, and find out what it is about me that makes me able to do this. I'm not even sure what that is, but it may be around trauma, issues around belonging, whatever. We need to find out what it is about me that makes me able to do this. Once we've got that, and listed what it is and in order of importance, then we need to go out and find other people with those attributes, select for that, and then train them. But at the moment, we haven't even got to why I'm really able to do this, what equips me to do it. We need to research that and go from there. Because it's not about the group member coming through and being the facilitator. It's about, I'm a straight goer, so I'm not violent. I'm scared of violence, and it's just too much for me. However, when we work together as a team and cooperate, that's when the magic, if you like, of SVI happens. So we've got Basil and other terrific colleagues who can come through the programme. We need more of me to then link up and make that team.
Sorry, can I just add, like, what John was saying, yeah? Like, a lot of the problems is, a lot of the people that try to do similar work, like SVI, they have some hidden agenda or some hidden motive, and, you know, instead of trying to help the person, they're more like, what can we do, you know what I'm saying, like with the whole, I don't want to say his name, but, you know, the person who introduced the SVI, if you want to talk about that. Or, you know, what happened in the prison, what happened, you don't have to mention it, but what happened in the prison setting where you invited someone to try and do the work you do, and he wasn't able to, if you want to talk about that.
I don't know. You know, it's very hard.
You know what I'm talking about. You don't have to mention his name.
What can happen, right, brilliant point. What can happen is people say, right, I want you to work with this person, and then it's just not doable. We've got to start from the basics, and someone's got to research me first and work out what it is we're actually looking for in a facilitator working alongside group members coming through. And I'm not sure what that is, but it can be researched. People can find out, and then we'll be in a stronger position.
Jonathan, we've run out of time. I have one last question at the back, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hiya, Basil. I would just listen to the relationship and the facilitator, but I was just wondering, when you were in a session, if there was any point that you really could become violent, but obviously working with Joel is different. If you ever felt, you know, the need to explore, like, because it's obviously very intense when you've been going through the sessions.
Yeah, sometimes like things have got heated where, you know, me and someone's argued with each other over something so trivial, and, you know, it's gotten like near to, you know, violent, but obviously things get de-escalated. So there's been a time where me and Joe, as a facilitator, we had a sort of argument, and what was amazing about it was everyone else, instead of encouraging us to, like, you know, everyone was like, calm down, and, you know, it's just this amazing atmosphere. Like, words can't explain it. You have to see it to believe it. So, you know, there has been times, you know, where things have got escalated, but, you know, there's never been any violence. You know, I don't understand that. You know, people have had fights with each other, gone to SVI, and, you know, they haven't fought with each other. Obviously, I can't say 100% because I don't know now what's going on. Now Joe's no longer doing SVI in a prison setting, but from my recollection,
So what's the recollection?
Recollection, there's never been any physical contact in SVI, which is... You know,
So perhaps we can say, in answer to that question, yes, you may have been experiencing the shame triggers that lead to violence in a session, and that's actually the whole point of the programme, is to experience that and work with that. Thank you very much.